The truth was never meant to be spoken, but here you are listening to it anyway. And once you hear what happened in Pennsylvania in 1891, you will never walk through the shadows of a carnival without feeling that something is still there, watching from beneath the floorboards of memory. The story begins not with applause, not with laughter, not with the bright lights of a traveling show, but with the smell of damp earth and the rattling of chains, echoing where no audience was ever meant to sit. 17 performers locked away beneath the very stage where families cheered above their heads, 17 souls hidden like cursed relics beneath the illusion of spectacle. They called it a freak show, yet what was on display under the lantern light was only half the truth. Above were the grotesque smiles, the painted faces, the twisted bodies designed to shock and amuse, but below, in the silence of the basement, lay the deeper horror, one that no ticket buyer ever knew. Imagine the sound of heavy boots pacing across the boards above your head, while your wrists are raw from iron shackles. Imagine hearing the laughter of strangers who think you are free when you know you will never walk outside again. This was not entertainment. This was captivity wrapped in spectacle. The audience thought they were staring at oddities, when in truth they were staring at prisoners who had been broken into obedience. It is said that when investigators finally forced their way into the hidden room, what they saw did not match the human form as we know it. Some crouched like animals, their limbs twisted, not by birth, but by years of confinement. Others whispered words that made no sense. Syllables spoken to themselves as if they had forgotten language altogether. The question that lingers like smoke is why keep them chained when they could already perform? Why lock them in filth when their presence alone drew crowds? The basement was never built for people. It was built as a storage pit, a forgotten foundation where the ground sweated moisture and the air stank of rot. Yet in 1891, it became a dungeon, a place where humanity was stripped away and turned into something else. Entirely lantern light, revealed not beds or straw, but bare stone floors etched with scratches from nails and bone, where desperate hands clawed at the walls as if digging might lead to freedom. But no tunnel was ever finished. Only grooves that spoke of suffering interrupted by exhaustion. Those 17 were not merely chained. They were displayed even in the dark. The shackles were arranged in a circle as if designed for ritual, not imprisonment. Some say the ringmaster studied books older than the Republic books that whispered about how to reshape the human body through suffering, how to reshape the human mind through fear. If this is true, then the freak show was not just business. It was experimentation, a theater of control with the public cheering on one side and the true audience hidden behind locked doors. Imagine their faces. The bearded woman whose eyes once shone with defiance now dulled into vacant glass. The giant whose bones cracked under the weight of chains so heavy they left grooves in his shoulders. The child contortionist who no longer folded his body for applause, but twisted himself against the restraints until skin tore. These were not anomalies of nature. They became anomalies of power, shaped by cruelty, sharpened by silence. When the law finally uncovered the basement, the officers wrote in their journals of sights they could not fully describe. Some of the performers crawled forward, blinded by the sudden light, as if they had become subterranean creatures. Others hissed and wept, their teeth bared, their mouths foaming like beasts that no longer remembered what it meant to be human. It was said the youngest among them. The newspapers told half the story, and the rest was erased by order of men whose names were never printed. Local officials swore the case was closed. Yet whispers spread through Pennsylvania taverns that the freak show had not been the first, nor would it be the last. Traveling carnivals vanished from towns overnight, leaving behind unpaid debts and rumors of missing workers. What was discovered in that basement was a glimpse, not an exception. The carnival itself was a mask. Bright tents painted in red and gold, concealing the machinery of hunger beneath the performers above ground, distracted the crowds with illusions while beneath their feet human beings were devoured slowly, not by claws or fangs, but by starvation, fear, and psychological breaking. There is a reason the chains were never rusted. They were polished by hands that gripped and twisted them every night, by bodies writhing in endless circles, like offerings placed before an invisible altar. And who was that altar for? Was it the ringmaster's greed? Or was it something more? Some witnesses swore the performers were arranged in patterns resembling ancient symbols, symbols connected to cults that predated the state itself. No one wanted to acknowledge that the freak show might not have been about money at all, but about ritualized domination, about forcing men, women, and children into shapes that entertained something unseen. Even more chilling were the testimonies suppressed from the record. A doctor summoned to examine the survivors wrote in a private letter that their eyes did not react like normal eyes to light, that their pupils remained fixed wide even in midday sun, as if they had been trained to embrace darkness as their master. He noted how their voices carried an unnatural cadence, almost chant-like, as if whatever kept them bound had reprogrammed their very speech. The question that should haunt you is this: were they prisoners? The official narrative claimed the rescued 17 were returned to their families, but records show only 5 names were ever documented. The rest vanished into silence, as if they had never lived at all. Census reports from neighboring towns list no trace of them, no graves, no marriages, no deaths, only gaps where human lives should have been filed. And in those gaps, one truth echoes louder than any archive. Silence is not absence, it is erasure. Some whispered that the missing 12 were not freed, but moved quietly into another basement this time, not beneath a carnival, but beneath institutions with marble pillars and iron gates. If you understand history, you know that freak shows were laboratories for power training grounds, where methods of control were sharpened chain the body chain. The mind then sell the broken spirit back to society, dressed as entertainment or medical progress. Look deeper into the years after 1891, and you find uncanny echoes in asylums where patients were locked in cells and called specimens in hospitals, where poor immigrants were tested with drugs, never meant for cure, in schools for the feeble-minded, where children were paraded before officials as proof of state charity while hidden rooms turned them into case studies. The carnival was only the mask. Behind it stood the machinery of institutional cruelty. Even the architecture of the basement holds meaning. Eyewitness sketches show iron rings bolted into the stone in patterns that resembled constellations, not random placement, but deliberate mapping. Why chain human beings into star patterns unless you are trying to recreate some forgotten cosmology, some ritual of order and submission? When lawmen burst into that basement, they did not stumble upon crime, they stumbled upon a design, and that design has never gone away. It mutates, changes, its costume hides in hospitals, in prisons, in laboratories, in corporate The newspapers that reported the rescue of the 17 captives told the story with grotesque exaggeration, painting them as pitiful, malformed creatures who would never fit into normal life. But what is striking is how quickly the story disappeared after the first headlines. By the next week, it was replaced with farm auctions and political scandals, and by the following month it was erased entirely, as if the public had been commanded to forget. Forgetfulness itself was the weapon here, the chain more powerful than iron when a horror is shown. Once then buried, it does not vanish. It sinks into the unconscious of a nation, festering, shaping beliefs about who deserves freedom and who deserves the basement. The press was not reporting the truth. It was performing a ritual of memory control, ensuring the event lived only as a fleeting spectacle, rather than a permanent wound. Whispers spread that the men who ran that Pennsylvania carnival were not fugitives, but agents of something larger, a network that moved from city to city, buying orphans from desperate parents, collecting the deformed and the unwanted, the poor, who could not resist. They called it a freak show, but it was closer to a harvesting, a gathering of human anomalies for purposes the public was never meant to see. Entertainment was only the curtain, and behind that curtain something more sinister unfolded. Certain letters preserved from the sheriff's office mentioned that among the rescued were children with uncanny traits, eyes of different colors, skin that glowed faintly in lantern light, voices that could mimic others perfectly. Such descriptions vanished from the official record, yet in the margins of those letters in faded ink, someone wrote the words, "Not human." Think about that for a moment. Not human. So ask yourself what exactly was being chained in that basement. Were they broken performers, or were they living keys to knowledge? When the basement was opened and the chains struck free, some of the captives did not cry out for joy. They did not run toward the light. Instead, they recoiled, covering their eyes, their voices trembling like animals driven back into the wild. Too long away from the sun, this reaction unsettled the rescuers who expected gratitude, but instead faced fear. Fear, not of the captors, but of freedom itself. That moment reveals a deeper truth. Once you are caged long enough, your prison becomes your home. And the thought of stepping into open air feels like stepping into death. This is not weakness. It is programming, the reshaping of the human will, until chains are mistaken for comfort. Think about the way institutions today train men to love their own limitations, binding them with invisible restraints, harder to break than any iron clasp. A preacher present at the scene later confessed in his journal that when he looked into the eyes of one of the rescued children, he felt something unnatural staring back at him. He described it as wisdom too ancient for the face of a child, knowledge that did not belong to any school or scripture, but something older, something predating the written word. It left him shaken, unable to preach for months. What had those children been taught in that dark cellar? Because here lies the forbidden question. What if those who ran that carnival were not just exploiting bodies, but cultivating minds, shaping these chained performers into vessels of some deeper plan, not merely entertainers, but experiments? The strange traits, the unnatural behaviors. The silence followed by sudden bursts of song, none of it fits the idea of a simple sideshow. It suggests a ritual of transformation, hidden in plain sight. The sheriff who wrote the initial report was later reassigned, far from Pennsylvania, his documents sealed and locked away. Yet a single page escaped into private hands, where it describes not 17 captives, but 19, 2 of whom were never accounted for. Names erased, ages unknown, only the phrase returned to their master, scribbled beside the number. Who was this master, and why was his claim more powerful than the law itself? So you see, the rescue was never complete. 17 bodies freed, yet 2 taken back into the shadows, perhaps back into the circuit that spanned states, perhaps into laboratories that never appeared in public record. What was displayed to the people as freak entertainment was in reality the tip of a hidden pyramid undesigned not for laughter, but for control, not for spectacle, but for inheritance. The newspapers of 1891 gave the public a softened version of events. They spoke of cruelty and criminality, yet left out the details that could break the illusion of order, because behind every headline, there is always a deeper silence. A silence bought with bribes or forced with threats. The citizens of Pennsylvania were told that the performers had been released and that the owners of the carnival would face justice. But justice never came. The charges were dismissed. The witnesses scattered, the papers folded into archives, as if the whole thing had been a passing scandal rather than a revelation of something ancient and monstrous. Some survivors were quietly placed in sanitariums far from prying eyes, their testimonies too wild for polite society. They spoke of rituals in the basement ceremonies, where the captors dressed in cloaks painted with spirals and symbols not found in any church. They spoke of nights when music was played, not for entertainment, but for summoning, when drums echoed like heartbeats beneath the floorboards, and voices chanted words that burned the ears of children too young to understand, but too old to ever forget. You must understand that this was not an isolated crime, but a glimpse into the architecture of control, freak shows, circuses, carnivals. These were not merely diversions for the masses. They were traveling experiments where the lines between amusement and ritual blurred under the guise of entertainment. Men and women were pushed beyond the boundaries of body and mind, twisted for profit. Yes, but also for knowledge that could never be published in textbooks. Knowledge that belonged to a shadow world, which thrives on the suffering of the forgotten. Why did the law protect the ringleaders? Because the carnival itself was not their own creation. They served higher patrons, men in suits who never dirtied their hands, but directed the show from afar. The freak show was merely a theater of power, its basement a hidden cathedral for the secret hunger of those who rule unseen. Think of it this way: if 17 performers could vanish into chains, without public uproar, what else could be hidden in America's shadows? At that time, what towns, what factories, what orphanages hid? Similar experiments disguised under the mask of progress or charity. The Donnelly case, the Weaver boy, the laughing man in London, all threads in the same tapestry, a tapestry woven to prove that ordinary men are blind to extraordinary evil when it wears the costume of spectacle or science. And so the freak show in Pennsylvania was not shut down. It was simply relocated, renamed, reshaped into another form. The stage remained, but the curtain changed, and the audience applauded, without ever knowing they were watching, prisoners of a much older order. Imagine the silence after the crowd dispersed, the carnival wagons rolling into the night, their painted signs swaying like masks in the wind, beneath the wheels. 17 lives had been shattered. Yet the town spoke of it as if it were only scandal gossip, something to be swallowed with the morning paper and forgotten by supper. But silence like that does not erase what happened. It only buries it deeper, where the roots of power feed. One of the survivors wrote a letter decades later before he disappeared again. He claimed the basement was not simply a prison. It was a chamber of study. The chains were arranged, not randomly, but in a pattern, circles within circles, as if the suffering itself was part of a design, an experiment in breaking down the human spirit and reshaping it into something else. He described nights when a single lantern would swing above them, casting shadows like symbols across the stone walls. Symbols, he insisted, had been carved long before the carnival ever arrived. That basement may not have been built by the carnival at all. It may have been inherited, a relic of an older order, hidden beneath the ground, waiting for men bold enough to use it. And the carnival owners were merely caretakers, playing their role in a script older than the Republic itself. When you strip away the laughter and the applause, you see the carnival for what it truly was, a moving mask to conceal ancient rituals under the cloak of entertainment. You must ask yourself, how many such basements exist across this country's cellars? Tunnels, catacombs beneath churches, factories, or homes, places where official history says nothing but where unofficial history whispers too much. The freak show was a window, but only one window into a house of many locked rooms. This is why the performers were called freaks, because society needed a label to strip them of their humanity. Once you strip a man of his name, his dignity, his lineage, he becomes a specimen, not a soul, and a specimen can be chained, measured, and experimented upon without guilt. The crowd believed they were watching entertainment, but in truth, they were participating in ritual. They were witnesses to cruelty, disguised as wonder. The freak show ended for the public, but not for the bloodline of power behind it. Those who orchestrated the experiment did not vanish. They simply refined their methods, finding new ways to chain men and women without iron, using contracts, debt, narratives, and institutions, until the chains were invisible and the basement became the entire world. The newspaper clippings said the carnival disbanded and the owners were questioned, but no charges were ever filed. The authorities spoke of misunderstanding, of exaggeration, of hysteria. Yet the basement remained, the evidence carved into stone. Beneath that Pennsylvania town could not be dismissed, yet it was sealed off, as if sealing a tomb. Why? Because the truth beneath it was never meant for daylight. One investigator who pressed too far claimed the chains were not forged in the 19th century at all. They bore a style of metallurgy, older, rougher, as though they had been reforged again and again across centuries, carrying with them the residue of countless captives before the performers were ever born. He vanished weeks later. His final words left, scribbled in a journal, read, "The carnival is only the surface." Think of this: the carnival traveled from town to town, setting up tents and stages as if conjured from thin air. But its power did not come from wood and canvas. Its power came from the ground beneath it. It always chose places already marked, already prepared, as if a map was guiding them. A map not of roads, but of hidden sites of power. The basement in Pennsylvania was not unique. It was only one node of a larger web. Do you see how the performance worked above ground? The audience laughed at deformity. They drank, they clapped, they surrendered themselves to spectacle. Below-ground chains, rattled bodies, with rare conditions were kept alive, like living texts to be studied, to be broken, to be reordered. It was duality. The face of wonder, concealing the face of cruelty, and the crowd, without knowing, became complicit, feeding the ritual with their attention, their money, their fascination. This is the part of history that feels heavier than myth, because it hides not in shadows, but in the blind spot of what people choose not to see. You were told the carnival was harmless. Nostalgia, a quirk of the P. Asked, yet here lies the evidence that it was an apparatus of something far older and far darker. Institutions shift names, they shift costumes, but their essence remains. And here is the chilling question. How many of today's entertainments serve the same purpose? How many spectacles are designed not to delight, but to distract while the real experiment continues elsewhere? You laugh at the idea of freak shows, yet they never ended. They only changed masks. The stage is different, but the basement is still waiting, and men are still chained, not by iron, but by illusions, carefully arranged to keep them docile, while the true architects feed on their submission. The silence surrounding the Pennsylvania basement was not mere neglect. It was deliberate erasure. Reporters who tried to follow the story were silenced, their articles pulled from circulation, their names quietly omitted from later records, as though the event never occurred. Even families of the performers were threatened with loss of livelihood if they demanded answers. This was not an isolated freak show. This was the hand of something larger, something organized, ensuring that the hidden would remain hidden. Consider the timeline every decade from the mid-1800s forward, whispers of chained performers. Surface in different states, Iowa, Illinois, Kentucky always, the same elements, a traveling carnival, a basement or cellar, a number of men and women kept beneath the stage for reasons unexplained. Witnesses reported cries at night. Strange deliveries arriving after dark, wagons covered in tarps, unloading objects that no one ever saw again. And then silence, because local sheriffs ordered mouths shut. If you think this was random exploitation, you are wrong. This was structured like a system. It used the image of the carnival to mask its work, the bright lights, the gaudy posters, the barkers pulling crowds off dusty streets. That was the camouflage. What lay beneath was the true purpose, and the pattern repeated so perfectly across years and miles that chance cannot explain it. Only design can. Ask yourself this: why performers with unusual bodies? Why not prisoners? Why not orphans? Why specifically those born with deformities, with growths, with twisted bones? The answer is as disturbing as it is clear. Their bodies held keys, and nature had encoded mutations like secrets, And someone wanted access to those secrets. Someone saw these people not as men and women, but as raw material. When the Pennsylvania basement was discovered, the chains were arranged in a precise circle, not scattered, not random. A circle, inscribed on the floor, a geometry too exact for chance. It suggests ritual, but not ritual, in the way you were taught. This was not superstition, it was engineering. It was an attempt to unlock forces through flesh, through suffering, through the distortion of the human form itself. Now ask the harder question, who benefited from this work? Because if the carnival was the mask, then behind the mask stood patrons men, who had the money to finance such cruelty sen, who remained untouchable. Names, never printed faces, never seen, the crowd thought they were watching curiosities. But in truth, they were feeding a machine built to extract something far darker from the bodies below. The deeper you descend into this story, the more you realize the carnival was never for entertainment at all. It was a harvesting ground. The spectators were distractions. The real spectacle was not above the stage, but beneath it, where flesh was chained and measured, where voices cried out in the dark, only to be muffled by stone walls and heavy locks. Each body was an experiment, each deformity a cipher. And the men who ran these circuits treated the human form like parchment to be read and rewritten. Look closely at the timing. 1891 was not simply the year of discovery, it was also the year when whispers of secret medical societies surged across the Northeast. Physicians who had failed in traditional practice suddenly disappeared from public records, yet carnival ownership changed hands in those same towns. This is no coincidence. It was migration from one mask to another. They abandoned stethoscopes for cages and journals for basements, where no law could follow them. The chained performers were not random acquisitions. They were hunted, tracked down, purchased under the guise of recruitment. The language used in contracts promised shelter and livelihood. But once the performers signed their names, they were signing away freedom. The carnival kept their faces on posters while their bodies were hidden underground. Meaning, some who appeared on stage were illusions. Stand-ins while the true individuals wasted away. Below, that duality was intentional. It fractured reality. It made the audience complicit in a lie. Do you see what that means? The carnival was not just performance, it was psychological conditioning. It trained the townspeople to dismiss what their senses told them to accept. Contradiction without question, to clap for an image while ignoring the absence of the original. It was the birth of distraction. Culture long before media, long before screens, men in coats used freak shows as laboratory. For the human mind. And beneath it all, the performers chained in the basement were transformed into symbols, unwilling offerings of bone and blood, their suffering mapped onto geometry, carved into circles on the floor. The basements were altars, not for gods, but for men who sought power beyond the human limit, and the chains themselves were inscriptions, binding not just flesh, but identity. This is why the story was buried. This is why records vanished, because if you understood what was happening beneath the carnival, you would never trust a stage again. You would never trust the mask again. You would begin to see the chains, not only in that basement, but in your own world, hidden beneath every spectacle you are given to consume. Imagine the silence of that basement, when the carnival left town, the wagons rolling away, the tents folded, the laughter gone, and yet beneath the abandoned fairgrounds, there remained the faint sound of iron scraping against stone, the faint echo of voices calling for release. No audience above, no music, no fire breathers, only the forgotten 17, chained in the earth like roots, no longer meant to rise. Some accounts claim the bodies were eventually discovered. Skeletal remains, with wrists still locked in iron cuffs. Yet the official record is strangely quiet. Newspapers from the period mention a carnival fire in passing, but none mention human remains. It is as though the truth was erased, excised deliberately, as though someone higher than carnival owners made sure no record survived. And this silence is more damning than any scream, because silence in history means protection for the guilty. The architecture of the basement itself is a question who built it. Carnival owners did not construct foundations of stone with drainage systems and torch brackets. No, this was older, pre-existing long before the carnival. Set foot in Pennsylvania. There were vaults beneath the ground vaults that the carnival merely repurposed, meaning the performers were not the first to be chained there, only the latest in a lineage of entrapment. The stones themselves carried the weight of centuries of confinement. And you must ask, why Pennsylvania? Why in 1891 did this eruption of horror surface here? Because this land had been marked before. This was coal country. Steel country land that fed empires, and every empire leaves hidden chambers where flesh is ground into power. The carnival was not an anomaly. It was continuation. The same machinery that consumed workers in factories consumed performers in basements. Different masks, same hunger. Think of it this way. The freak show above was entertainment, but the freak show below was a mirror of society. Above one was laughter. One was industry, one was chains in the dirt, the other was chains of labor. Both were systems built to devour human beings, and the men who ran both learned from one another, shared hands, shook in secret meetings in back rooms, where contracts were signed in smoke-filled silence. So when you hear of the 17 chained, do not imagine them as isolated victims. Imagine them as symbols of a system that thrives in plain sight and thrives more powerfully underground. You were never meant to know they existed, because if you did, you might begin to see the hidden chambers beneath your own life. The chains that are polished, invisible, but no less real. When authorities finally walked into that basement, they described the air as so heavy, it clung to their lungs. The smell of rust mold and something else, something unmistakable yet unspoken. The odor of human suffering seeping from stone. The chains were not merely restraints, they were inscriptions. Each link etched with scratches, marks made by fingernails. Desperate attempts to carve words or prayers into iron, none were legible, only fragments of shapes that looked less like letters and more like sigils, as though the prisoners had slipped into something deeper than language. The strange part is this. No official report names the 17, no census entry matches them. No missing person registry aligns with their descriptions, as if they never existed at all, or as if their identities were erased before discovery. Some believe the performers were not hired, but taken bought by traveling agents who scoured rural towns for the deformed, the broken, the orphaned children no one would report missing, then delivered them into the hands of carnival masters who chained them not for shows, but for rituals. Because this was not theater, this was sacrifice, and the freak show was only a mask for the true spectacle, a feeding ground for something much older. The basement was not about performance. It was about containment of energies, energies drawn out through pain, fear, and isolation. These 17 were batteries, their torment harvested like coal, like steel, fueling powers unseen. And if you think this is superstition, look at the timing. 1891 was a year of collapse. Financial markets trembling, riots breaking out, workers striking across the east, factories aflame, power shifting like tectonic plates. The basement of the carnival was not separate from this. It was a parallel stage, where human lives were drained to stabilize the chaos above, as though every scream in the earth was an offering to keep the empire from cracking apart. The most disturbing testimony came from a worker who refused to speak openly, but scrawled a warning in the margins of a church ledger. 17 are not dead. They are waiting. Waiting not for rescue, but for release, not for freedom, but for another curtain to rise. He wrote that the chains were not broken. When found, they were unlatched, opened as if by unseen hands, no tool marks, no keys, simply released. And that is the forbidden image, the one that lives at the edge of history. 17 shadows unshackled, walking out of the basement, not recorded, not named, only felt in the tremors of the years that followed. Imagine for a moment that the chains did not hold them at all, but that the chains held something back, and when they fell open, it was not escape, but emergence. Those who witnessed the scene described silence, no cries for help, no gasps of relief, just a stillness broken only by the sound of the iron dropping to the floor, as if 17 lives had rehearsed this moment for years, waiting not for freedom, but for permission. Authorities attempted to escort the performers out, but many refused to step into the sunlight. They shielded their eyes, as though daylight was poison. They clung to the shadows of the doorway, and some whispered words. Not in English, not in any language, recognized words that carried rhythm, like chants, phrases they had carved into the walls again and again. Like rehearsals for summoning, one officer later admitted in a letter to his brother that he felt he was not rescuing them, but interrupting something in progress. And for that he feared punishment, not from law, but from forces unseen. The newspapers wrote little at the time, only a few paragraphs buried in the back sections, a freak house discovered in rural Pennsylvania. But quietly the story spread, through whispers in taverns and train stations. People said the performers had teeth filed sharp, not naturally but intentionally. Some said their eyes adjusted to dark, so completely they could see where no one else could. Others swore they saw the children grown into adults who never aged, the same faces at different carnivals across decades unchanged, as if time refused to touch them. And here lies the darker suspicion. What if these 17 were not victims at all, but vessels? What if their captivity was not cruelty, but cultivation, shaping them into conduits for something larger? Their pain, the soil, their despair, the water, their isolation, the sunlight of the ritual. What if? When the chains fell, their transformation was complete, and what rose from that basement was not 17 broken people, but 17 chosen beings. History buried the incident, but look closely at the years after 1891 freak shows, multiplied across America, not merely for entertainment, but as if something demanded expansion. New circuits, new crowds, new energy flowing into tents, under gaslight. Was this coincidence, or was it harvest? And if it was harvest, who was feeding? Because the truth is this: the freak show never died. It only evolved into new forms hidden under other names, drawing you into the spectacle, making sure the lights stay lit, while something hungrier feeds backstage. When the public thought the performers were freed, their story should have ended. But endings are illusions. Men in polished shoes from Philadelphia and Washington arrived within days. They carried no uniforms, only papers stamped with seals, and a silence that made sheriffs obey without question. The 17 were not released to families, nor allowed to vanish into common life. Instead, they were escorted into carriages with curtains drawn and disappeared down the road that led east, and after that, no trace remained. Official records list nothing. No hospital intakes, no asylum, ledgers, no burial plots. But whispers suggest they were taken to private estates, funnises, where the elite gathered for rituals hidden behind oak doors and marble facades. They did not see monsters in the performers. They saw material raw substance to be molded, a living resource for experiments of body and soul. Why chain them for years, if not to break them open until they became more than human, less than human? Something in between pain does not only destroy, it reshapes thought, warps memory, rewrites identity in ways ordinary discipline cannot. The freak show was the mask, but beneath the mask was design, a pattern, stretching far deeper than carnival smoke and painted tents. And yet the people sensed it, even if they could not prove it. Letters from small towns told of children who vanished after fairs rolled through, farmers who claimed animals were born deformed after strange lights hovered above the tents, travelers who swore the laughter of performers carried for miles long after the carnival packed its wagons as if the land itself absorbed the sound. Now I ask you to see the connection. The freak show was never about curiosity. It was a factory of transformation, and you live among its descendants. Even now, the world still builds basements where the broken are chained, still feeds despair into rituals that no newspaper or dares report. The question is not whether they survived. It is what they became after the chains fell. And this is where you must pause. Look inward and decide whether you want to go further, because from here, the story no longer belongs to the past. It begins to pull into the present, and if you continue, the shadows that marked those 17 will begin to mark you as well. The trail leads into silence, but silence is not absence, it is concealment. Those who orchestrated the freak show left no confession, yet their fingerprints remain in the institutions that rose around the same years. The asylums with iron bars and barred windows, the hospitals where patients vanished into locked wards, the laboratories where poor bodies became test subjects. In the name of progress, the freak show was never shut down. It was upgraded and absorbed into systems that wear the mask of science. 17 chained in a basement became the prototype. They learned how to fracture the human spirit, how to train men and women to forget themselves until they could be rewritten. A skill that institutions crave when building obedient societies. The performers were rehearsals, sacrifices for the age of control that followed. Think of the timing. The late 1800s, a nation bruised by civil war. Desperate for order, railroads tying coasts together, factories swallowing thousands of laborers. The elite required not just bodies, but minds that would bend without breaking. What better testing ground than those already marked as outsiders? Those no one would rescue, those who could vanish without consequence. And yet the witnesses spoke of strange resilience, of voices that chanted in unison in the dark of night, of eyes that glowed with a fevered clarity, as if the 17 had seen beyond flesh and bone into realms where chains meant nothing. Could suffering itself awaken a power? The architects of control did not expect. Perhaps the freak show birthed not only victims, but visionaries, beings whose minds were sharpened by torment into something uncontainable. This is the secret no one dared print in a paper, the reason officials erased names and records. The fear that in their cruelty they had accidentally crafted prophets, instead of puppets, individuals who could not be absorbed into any system but would live as fragments of forbidden knowledge, walking reminders that control can never fully cage the human spirit. And now ask yourself, what if some escaped? What if the silence that followed was not victory, but failure? What if the 17 became seeds scattered across the country, sowing whispers that grew into hidden movements and lineages, waiting for the right generation to hear their call? You watching this are closer to them than you realize, closer than history has prepared you to accept. You have been led through fragments of blood and shadow. But here, the path splits into something even darker, for the freak show was not an isolated horror. It was a mirror a stage where the world tested its appetite for spectacle, cruelty, and obedience. The basement in Pennsylvania was not just a crime scene. It was a blueprint, a rehearsal for the empire of entertainment and distraction that would rise in its wake. Look closely at the timing. The freak show collapsed in silence, just as mass media began its ascent. Newspapers, cheap pulp novels, traveling theaters, circuses, with far more polish and money. Yet the formula remained the same. Keep the public entertained. Keep their eyes fixated on the strange, the grotesque, the exaggerated. While behind the curtains, real chains rattled in factories, prisons, and institutions. The 17 chained beneath the floor were never meant to be seen. They were only the raw experiment. What followed was refinement. Do you see it? The same psychology that made people pay to gawk at deformity was reshaped to make them pay to consume illusions. Illusions of power, illusions of wealth, illusions of control. The audience trained itself to hunger for distraction, and in doing so, offered its obedience willingly. You think the freak show ended, but it only moved into your newspapers, your radios, your televisions, your glowing screens. The basement simply got bigger until it swallowed the world. And the greatest trick was simple: to teach you to feel safe while watching chains, to believe you were free while applauding the captive, to mistake suffering for entertainment. Once that shift was achieved, the architects of control no longer needed basements in Pennsylvania. They had entire nations hooked on distraction, hypnotized by spectacle, asleep, while power moved in silence. But the 17 remain like ghosts in the circuitry of history. When you feel the unease while watching, numb the screen when something inside you whispers that what you are seeing is not real. That is their voice. That is their warning. It is not entertainment. It is repetition of an ancient ritual. The ritual that began in chains. You are meant to forget them, but forgetting is obedience. Remembering is rebellion. To recall the 17 is to pierce the illusion, to see through the layers of distraction and recognize the pattern. The same pattern that wraps around you, even now. And if you awaken fully, you will never see this world as safe again. The stage is almost empty now. Yet the truth is louder than any applause. For the freak show of 1891 was not just a crime scene in Pennsylvania. It was the mask pulled back for a moment, a forbidden glimpse into how humanity is broken, trained, and reshaped into something obedient. The chains were crude, the whips obvious, the cages physical. But what followed was more perfect and more terrifying. Invisible shackles. Psychological prisons made not of iron, but of belief. You were never supposed to know that the 17 chained beneath that basement were chosen not only for their deformity, but for their resistance, their refusal to conform to the script of polite society. They were born outside the design, and for that they were harvested, turned into examples meant to warn others. What happens when you do not fit the mold of the system? But the warning was inverted, hidden, twisted so the public learned only mockery, only obedience, while the deeper truth was buried in silence. Do you understand now? The same system still exists. It wears a new mask. It calls itself progress. It calls itself entertainment. It calls itself freedom. But beneath every smiling surface are the same chains, the same cages, the same cold hands pulling the strings. The freak show never ended. It only refined itself. It only grew into something vast and inescapable. And here you stand at the edge of that realization. Your heart should feel heavier, your thoughts sharper, your awareness stretched like a blade, because the moment you know the ritual, the moment you see the chains behind the curtain, you can never unsee them. They will haunt every billboard, every flashing screen, every smiling face that demands your obedience. Now you must choose to look away and fall back into the crowd, or to step further into the forbidden, into the path carved by those 17 whose cries were swallowed by stone, but whose truth still burns in silence. See. If you have heard their story and felt the pull, then write these words below in the comments to seal it into your own transformation. I see the chains twice write it once for the memory of the 17 and once for the mirror of your own reflection in their suffering. Remember, this knowledge is not safe. It will not let you sleep as before. It was never meant for the masses. It was meant for the few who dare to awaken. The freak show has always been about you. And now you know.